progression from a particular clinical disease, or in the case of benzene, could be an aplasia or other blood disease, then you could then progress to leukemia. There are different ways of determining causality.
Okay.
Simply a measurement of benzene in the air doesn't, it indicates that there's that level of benzene in the air. That doesn't have anything to do with determining causality if you're doing a study.
Well, you've told us earlier in your deposition that you don't believe that there is any established threshold at which benzene exposure is safe, correct?
That's right, yes.
Now, would you agree that with each increase in the part per million that the likelihood of leukemia goes up?
Yes.
And at what point does that become statistically significant to you in terms of the degree of increase above ambient air or conditions?
Objection form.
Well, I wouldn't look at it. Statistical significance is one of the tools that's used to determine causality in an epidemiological study. So, I mean, once that's been determined, and we know the diseases that benzene causes, then you can determine what the dose response is. So it's not a question of, well, is it statistically significant at that level? It's like, what's the risk from that amount of exposure?
Okay, in terms of increasing the cumulative doses, what rate of increase over ambient air do you consider to be statistically significant, or is that possible to determine?
Objection form.
Well, like I was saying, I would look at it in terms of what the risk is from the level of exposure. You say, that's why you do dose response analysis, because you're trying to determine what the risk is from areas of the dose response curve where you don't have any information. That's why regulatory agencies do dose response. So you're trying to extrapolate to the areas where you don't have information to determine what the risk is.
And I guess we're not on the same page, and that's my fault. I'm trying to determine whether or not you feel that there is any statistical increase, there is any significance. Let me take out the word statistical. Whether or not there's any significance in the increase in the parts per million of benzene over ambient conditions that can be used to predict a higher likelihood of a leukemic death due to benzene exposure.
Objection form and asked and answered.
Well, I'm silent at the moment because I'm trying to understand what you're asking me. Could you ask it in another way, perhaps?
Could you read it back?
Okay.
And I guess we are not on the same page, and that's my fault. I'm trying to determine whether or not you feel that there is any statistical increase, there is any significance. Let me take out the word statistical. Whether or not there is any significance in the increase in the parts per million of benzene over ambient conditions that can be used to predict a higher likelihood of a leukemic death due to benzene exposure.
Do you understand my question from the word whether?
So are we, well, first, are we talking about epidemiological studies, or?
No, I'm asking, I'm talking about your opinion as an epidemiologist. There is no such, well, let me strike that. There is no such study that shows that type of relationship in terms of increase, correct?
Objection form.
But I guess I'm not understanding what the question is. Sorry.
Okay. Now, let me try it this way. Do you have an opinion as to what increase in risk of a disease is statistically significant?
Objection form.
Well, that would depend on the frequency of the disease and the background population.
And from an epidemiological standpoint, what type of increase would you expect in a population similar to the refinery workers in the Wong, Texas City study, for example?
Objection form.
Well, I can't, without focusing on the Wong, Texas City study, because I can't conjure up an image with that right now.
Okay.
So why don't we just talk in general?
If you would give me your
Okay.
understanding, that's fine, Doctor.
And, okay, and now the question was what? I'm sorry. Or what amount of increase, say, in the relative risk would I
Right.
consider statistically significant?
Yes.
Well, and I think I initially responded by saying, well, it depends on the frequency of the disease. If you have a disease that has a high background level, like heart disease or lung cancer, you could have a 5% increase that could be statistically significant. If you have a more rare disease, like leukemia, then you would need a higher relative risk probably to achieve statistical significance.
Okay. Getting back to your exhibits, and we've been looking at PI 11, 12, 13. What use did you make of these other than the fact that you denoted that there was a hydrocarbon or gasoline odor?
Just that there's potential for exposure from the pollution in the area.
Have you ever done an epidemiological study based upon vapors that were migrating from below the surface upward?
No.
Do you know of anyone who has conducted an epidemiological study based upon vapors that are migrating from underground upward?
Objection form.
Well, I don't know. That would be an epidemiological study. That would be more of a geophysical study or something like that.
Do you know of anyone who has attempted to do an epidemiological study to determine whether or not there is a higher risk of contracting leukemia where the benzene is underground and allegedly migrating to the surface?
I have not seen such a study.
Have you looked for such a study in connection with your report in this case?
I didn't. You know, there might be some studies like some of these. I didn't in this particular case. Like, where was the place in Massachusetts where there was some groundwater contamination and there was an elevated risk of leukemia? There might be some studies like that, but I didn't. I'm not aware of any that's ever evaluated anything like that specific for leukemia, actually, or any disease.
Okay. If you would, Doctor, turn with me to the document bearing Bates label PI 66. I think it's the one right after that.
Okay.
That's a letter from Mr. McLean himself. I recognize that crystal clear signature at the bottom that we've all come to know and love. And that's a letter from Mr. McLean to you dated May 21st, 2002, correct?
Yes.
And Scott is thanking you for talking to him on the telephone, correct?
Yes.
Did you, how long before you received this letter from Mr. McLean did you first have contact with him concerning this case?
You know, I can't recall now. That might have been the first conversation, or he might have called me once before, but probably around this time, I would guess.
Okay. At the time that you and Mr. McLean talked, did you try to reach any agreement as to how you would be compensated in this lawsuit?
Not at this time, no.
Dr. Infante, when you were working for OSHA and testifying as an independent expert, separate and apart from the government, you used to require a $2,500 non-refundable retainer that was not applied towards any hours you might work. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that still your practice?
Yes.
And what is your rate per hour?
$250 an hour.
Do you keep time records?
Well,
And if so, how?
yeah. Well, how do I keep? Various ways. In a case like this, before a deposition, I would, indicate, how many hours that I spent on the case.
Do you keep your hours contemporaneously, or do you go back like some lawyers have been known to do and reconstruct your hours?
Well, if I'm doing some particular task, I make an indication of what, how many hours I've spent on the case, and then.
Is it generally your practice to make that notation on the folder for the case file, or do you have a log?
Sometimes it's not consistent.
Do you keep a running total or a sheet in your case file showing the amount of hours that you devoted to a particular task?
Well, it's not necessarily specifive.
So that I won't waste your time, let me ask you, in this case, how have
Yeah.
you kept your hours?
I've written down how many hours I worked on which days since, I billed them last for it.
And where have you written those down in this case?
In a piece of paper that I have at home related to the case.
And when did you start writing those hours down?
It just would have been in the last, what's today, Monday? Certainly within the last week.
So at the time you authored this report on July 23rd, 2002, you had not kept a total for your hours, is that correct?
Well, I did, and I sent him a bill for that. And so now I've got a new set of hours going.
At the time you sent these papers to Mr. McLean for production to the defendants, was that hourly total or invoices, that hourly total in existence?
At the time I sent him this report?
Yes, sir.
No.
Okay. Subsequent to that report, did you send him an invoice?
Subsequent to it, yes.
And did that include all the hours that you had utilized up until the time that that report was generated?
Yeah, or it could have been if I did something for him after the report, and it would have included that also.
Okay. If we go back to the first page of exhibit number 3, you say, enclosed, please find materials pertaining to the above referenced case, and we have that date, and we've already established you wrote your report roughly 10 days after you received those materials. Could you tell me whether or not you had done any work on this case prior to the time you received these materials from Ms. Baca?
I probably did not, but I don't know for sure.
So your work on this probably commenced after you received the paperwork from Ms. Baca, correct?
Yes.
And over the 10 days between the time Ms. Baca sent you the documents that we've been laboriously going through, approximately how much time did it take you to examine those materials and to begin drafting the report? I'm not talking about finishing the report, but get to the point to where you could put pen to paper or finger to keyboard.
You don't want to know when I... Ask me it again, I'm not quite sure.
How long did it take, in terms of hours that you billed Mr. McLean's law firm, how long did it take you to go through those papers and to assemble materials so that you were ready to start writing this report?
Well, I mean, to assemble these papers?
Oh, sir, maybe I didn't ask my question clearly. I really apologize. My question is really, how much time did you bill Mr. McLean and his clients for between the time you started examining these papers,
Okay.
looking at any studies or reports that you may have deemed necessary to write your paper, your report in this case, and the time that you actually started writing your report?
Well, I didn't bill him for any time until after I completed the report.
Okay. How many hours did you use before, how many hours of your time did you use that you billed him for prior to the time that you started writing the report?
Well, I think probably hardly any. Because, I mean, the report was what I spent time writing.
And before you came for your deposition today, did you meet with Mr. McLean and prepare for this deposition?
Well, I talked to him on the phone.
On the phone.
About it, yeah. And, yesterday we had a short meeting.
And have you examined materials getting ready to take this deposition
Yes.
or to give this deposition?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll just go right to the bottom line. How many hours have you billed as of the commencement of this deposition for your work in this case at $250 an hour?
Gee, I don't know exactly. Preparing for this deposition, I looked at some literature. I read Dr. Wong's report. That was essentially it. And I don't know, 10 or 20 hours maybe.
Okay. And you've sent Mr. McLean an invoice since then, correct? Since you wrote the report?
I sent one after I wrote the report, yes.
Scott, can you produce that down the road?
Yes.
And that'll get us off. And you're charging, I assume, for your time today?
Yes.
And is that the same $250 an hour rate?
No.
What rate do you charge to give a deposition?
I charge $2,500 a day or for any portion of a day.
Do you have any idea approximately how much you have been paid for your work in this case thus far, other than the $2,500 initial retainer?
Yeah, I think something like maybe $4,500.
Okay. Now, going back to Exhibit 3 on page PI 66,
Yes.
Mr. McLean writes you that we are interested in retaining you to discuss the toxicity of the various chemicals in the plume, most notably benzene. In addition, we would like to develop expert testimony concerning the history of the oil industry's knowledge of this toxicity. And then he adds, of course, additional elements may be added as we further explore the dire situation confronting our clients. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
You accuse me of writing self-serving letters. I didn't agree. My question actually, Dr. Infante, is have you been limited to the tasks that Mr. McLean asked you to undertake in the first two sentences?
Yes.
Have you been asked to undertake, or do you see a need to undertake additional elements to explore the situation.
Objection 4.
Well, I haven't been asked to do any more.
Have you been asked to come to McAllen and testify in this case?
Yes.
Actually, Edinburgh.
Do I?
Actually,
Actually, Edinburgh, yes, thank you. But his plane will land in McAllen.
True.
Okay. If we could, let's look at the page marked 68. That's a letter from you to Mr. McLean. And basically, you said, send me an email when you receive this letter, and I will send you an electronic copy of my CV. Did Mr. McLean do anything other than just furnish you his email address? Or was there something substantive in the email he sent you other than his address?
I believe either he or one of his staff members has sent me an email asking. Sent me their email address, and I sent them a copy of my CV.
So this was purely for the purpose of being able to have some place to send the electronic copy of your CV, correct?
Yes.
Let's turn to page 69 and 70, which were 2 pages that you produced. This is a portion, I believe, of the expert report of Jack B. Madsen and Associates, dated August 1st, 1999, correct?
Yes.
And you reviewed this, correct?
Yes.
Have you ever worked with Dr. Madsen on a case before?
No.
Yeah. Have you had any conversations with Dr. Madsen concerning your work on this case?
No.
Let's talk. If you look at the next to the last paragraph, there are a number of terms underlined, such as benzene, relatively high vapor pressures, low aqueous solubilities. Who did that underlining?
I did.
What was the significance of this statement to you as an epidemiologist?
I was talking about because of the higher vapor pressure, saying there's a tendency for the compound to partition into the air phase, whether from a NAPL or dissolved phase source.
And
so he's just explaining why, when they did those, I presume the headspace analyses, why you see the benzene levels in there that you do.
And when you talk about partition into the air, what's your understanding of that term?
Well, it's like, I guess, for lack of a better way to express it, vaporizing into the air.
Do you have an understanding of the term volatilize or volatilization as it relates to these hydrocarbons, such as benzene and the other aromatics?
Objection 4.
Could you be more specific?
Do you understand what the term volatilize means in terms of the constituents of hydrocarbons, such as pentane, methane, butane, benzene, etc.?
Objection 4.
Well, volatilizing would have to do with the, how they move from the liquid phase, whatever phase they are, into the ambient air.
And would you expect benzene to volatilize sooner or later than hydrocarbon components with higher molecular weights?
I think they would. Well, what he's saying here is they have a relatively higher vapor pressure. That's what he's stating. So there's a tendency for them to partition into the air phase,
Which means
probably relatively greater than some of the other components.
Which means that the benzene and other high-pressure vapors would tend to go to the surface faster, is what he's saying, correct?
You didn't get to the air.
You're right. Now, if you look at the next page, which is PI 70, you've underlined some other words. Is that just your I take it that you're underlining, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And is that showing just the fact that Mattson has expressed an opinion that he feels that it is quote-unquote most probably entering buildings through cracks in foundations in the vicinity of the contaminated groundwater plume?
Yes.
And did you ever discuss with Mr. McLean, or have you looked at any records dealing with how many of the homes here are on a slab as opposed to up on pier and beams?
Well, it's my understanding that they don't have basements in that area. I didn't discuss any further what the foundation was.
In terms of cumulative dose, do you have any opinion as to whether it would be higher or lower in a home on pier and beams as opposed to one on slabs?
I don't have an opinion about that.
Now, Dr. Infante, if a business in this area where you've seen these levels, strike that, your conclusion in your report is that the benzene levels present in this area of McAllen present a risk. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you think that that risk is that it will allow or cause, like that. Your concern is that risk of benzene exposure will cause the development of some leukemic disorder or disease, correct?
There are some benzene-related disease, yes.
Okay. And would you agree with me that a business that's operating on top of that plume, knowing that vapor is migrating to the surface, has a duty, and into that business's structure has a duty to protect their employees from that benzene exposure?
Objection form.
That if there's a, let's see if I understand your question. If there's a business operating above that plume,
Right. And the
does that business have an obligation to protect its employees that I presume are in that building, right?
Correct.
From this additional exposure?
Yes.
Right?
That's my question.
Yes.
Do you think that?
Yes.
And do you think that they would be negligent if they did not advise their employees of the dangers that were being presented by the vapor?
Objection form.
Well, should I presume that they know, they have all this knowledge and
Yeah,
they're just not?
you should presume that the
informing?
business knows that there's vapor migration and that they know that Dr. Infante has said that it presents a risk of developing leukemic diseases. Presume the business knows that. Do they have a duty to warn their employees of the dangers?
Objection form.
Well, I mean, if they know of this information, if they know there's additional exposure there, then if they have employees that are in that area, they should inform them of
And if their employees are working in an enclosed building, 8 to 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes on Saturdays, do you feel that they have an increased risk of benzene exposure over the general population?
it. I mean, the general population that wouldn't be exposed to it.
Yes.
Well, if they got an increase in their exposure, then they have an increase in their risk.
And do you feel that that business has a duty to warn the public of that exposure when they're doing or transacting business in that enclosed business?
Objection.
Well, I think that if they have employees that are there every day, they're the ones that, I mean, they certainly should warn them. I mean, I don't know that, every petrochemical industry in the country warns someone that comes on the premises for a day that, hey, don't come on here. You know what I'm saying? I think you should, have some sense about it, and if people are there every day, if they're going to be subject to additional exposures, then they should know that.
And due to the additional exposures that you have seen as a result of your investigation into this particular site, should those employees be outfitted with some type of respirator to protect them from these increased benzene levels?
Objection form.
Well, I mean, I think probably the easiest way to deal with it would be through ventilation and having people wear personal protective equipment.
Okay. And what type of ventilation? Just standard air conditioning sufficient?
Well, something that would move the vapors out of the building. Fans, I think, comes to mind. I mean, I guess you'd have to consult with an engineer.
When you say fans, do you mean fans that would blow the air within the structure outside?
Right.
Would standard turbine vents be sufficient to remove the benzene at those levels to do away with the risk that you see?
Objection form.
Well, I think you'd have to ask an engineer about that.
Now, you have agreed that under the circumstances and looking at the levels you're looking at, that they are over the threshold, whatever that may be, to benzene exposure, that puts them at a causal risk of contracting some leukemic disease or other disease that's caused by benzene, correct?
Objection form.
Well, I didn't look at it in the way that you expressed it.
Okay. In any event, any person who was in a closed building where vapors were migrating into or under the building, as reported in Mr. Matson's report, would be at risk, in your opinion, correct?
Objection form.
And if they're going into areas where there would be, increased exposures to the benzene, then they have an increased risk. I haven't been asked to do any quantitative risk assessment in this case. I looked at it from the standpoint of what Matson had done. He said there were, average exposures to a certain level, and my understanding that then there can be periodic migration up into homes from cracks that could, who knows how long they might last until that situation is taken care of. So that's why I'm saying that there is an increased risk. I don't know what that increased risk is,
Okay,
without having data on specific monitoring from in those homes. I mean, if someone could provide that to me, I would be glad to look at it.
Okay, but if it were a business located on the plume as described by Dr. Matson, and the migration that Dr. Matson has described was occurring, you would agree that that business had at least a duty to warn and protect its employees
Objection.
from the increased risk of disease caused by benzene-related diseases.
Well, they could do two things. They could monitor to see if there is, but you're asking me to assume that there is elevated benzene.
Benzene at the levels Dr. Matson's reported, yes, that you've seen in this case.
Objection form.
Well, like I say, I wasn't going specifically by the levels that he reported. I was looking partially at levels that he reported. But then also, I think maybe a greater concern is that the potential for this periodic migration up into a home from cracks in the surface. And I based that on, I saw this, when they took the samples and they looked for how much benzene was partitioning off. And if that gets up into a home, then they've got a potentially elevated risk. So, that would, increase their risk above background. How much, I don't know. So whether or not they, should warn, going back to the business of people that are working, I guess that depends on how much, what the benzene concentration is there.
Why would you warn them?
Objection 4.
Warn the employees, that is.
Pardon me?
Why would you warn the employees?
Objection 4.
And you strike that. I apologize. Let me ask the question. You've looked at Dr. Madsen's report, correct?
Yes.
You've looked at some of the benzene levels that are volatilizing or vaporizing and rising, correct?
Yes.
And based upon the levels that you're seeing there, you feel that a risk is presented of a person who's exposed to that level of benzene contracting some leukemic disorder or other disease caused by benzene, correct?
There's that potential, yes.
And assuming all that, if that level is present in a building where a business is operated as opposed to a home, would you see any reason, strike that, would there be any difference, the fact that merely that it was a business as opposed to a home?
Objection 4.
Well, I think if I knew that there was this potential for exposure, I think I would do some monitoring to see the benzene level. Maybe there isn't any benzene, so you don't have to do anything. I mean, it wouldn't be a bad idea to let people know. In the area, though, I would think that, hey, you've got this potential for concern, and that's why you're doing the monitoring.
So, at the very least, good practice would be to conduct monitoring at that business, correct?
Objection 4.
Well, I would, unless you have some other way of determining it, which, I don't know. But what I'm saying is if there's a concern that you're going to have cracks and you're going to come up and people are going to be exposed to X level of benzene in the building, then you'd either want to have some ventilation to blow it out or periodically monitor. And then depending on, if you periodically monitor, then you would base your education or information to the people in the building based on what your results are. Or on the other hand, you could ventilate out the benzene, I guess, and you wouldn't have to worry about it.
Based upon your work with OSHA and your experience as an epidemiologist, would you see any increased risk if this were a structure that was off the ground and skirted around, that there would tend to be concentrations formed between the ground and the floor if it's enclosed by a skirt?
Objection 4.
Do you understand what I mean by the term skirt around a building?
So you're saying see if I understand what you're saying. If the floor surface where people are working, if below that, there's like a crawl space underneath which is enclosed.
Yes.
Okay, and what about that?
Would you expect in terms of the vapors for the benzene to accumulate in such an area and provide even more risk as a result of that enclosed skirting?
Well, more so than if it were opened.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's almost 1. Is this a good time for lunch?
You're the boss.
No, he's the boss.
Well, how late are we going to go in the afternoon? I don't know.
I think we were hoping to finish about 5 today and then pick back up maybe a little earlier tomorrow than we started today, since we didn't have...
Can we go off the record?
Yeah, off the record, please.
Off the record at 12:59:16.
We started-
2:18:54.
Dr. Infante, when we broke for lunch, I was asking you some questions concerning vapor concentrations under a skirted building, and you had told me, I believe, that you felt that the employer in such a business would at least have a duty to warn their employees that there was an increased risk of disease developing as a result of exposure to benzene. Do you recall that?
Objection 4.
Well, if there were elevated levels of benzene, yes. I think what I said is that if you have a place that's contaminate or has the potential for contamination, you could, the easiest way to deal with it would just be to vent it. Have some engineering devices to blow it out.
Well, and if you vented it, you would be venting it back into the neighborhood, correct? Assuming the building is in the middle of this neighborhood?
Yeah, but I mean, I would think it'd be pretty diluted with environmental air. It'd be better than having it concentrate in the home.
If the level of benzene is great enough that it presents a health risk, why would you want to monitor for it? Or why do you need to monitor for it?
Objection.
Well, I think I said you could do one of two things: either monitor to see if you had an elevated level, or alternately you could vent it, and then you wouldn't have to monitor for it.
We've talked about businesses. Let's talk about homes now. In a home, would you agree that where you have vapor migration and benzene at a level that is high enough to present a health risk, that the landlord of a home would have a duty to warn his tenants of the fact that there were levels of benzene in the home great enough to cause potential diseases to that individual?
Objection form.
Benzene-related diseases.
Objection form.
Yeah, under that circumstance, yes. I mean, if he wasn't going to do anything about it, I mean, alternately, you could do something about it just to get rid of the elevated exposures.
And again, that would call upon the landlord to do something like vent it to the outside atmosphere, et cetera, correct?
Yes.
And is it your opinion that under those conditions, that is, that there is a sufficient level of benzene to present a risk of causing benzene-related health problems, that the landlord in that case should monitor to determine the levels?
Objection form.
Let me see if I can paraphrase your question so I know what I'm answering. If there are indications that there are elevated levels of benzene in a home that would be associated with elevated risk of benzene-related diseases, then that landlord, if they're not going to ventilate, then they should inform the occupants of that exposure.
That's a good way,
Okay.
if you could answer that question.
Yes, I would say yes.
And under those circumstances, would it be a good idea for that landlord to monitor and take readings inside those homes?
Objection form.
Well, I think encompassed in the answer to the first question was that it said if there were, elevated exposures and elevated risks, then he should inform them. I guess so he would have to monitor to know that.
And again, what level, in your opinion, as an epidemiologist, would trigger the duty to warn?
Objection form.
Well, I think, that's like that's a policy. That's a policy determination on what would be considered a level that, I haven't thought about that in terms of duty to warn.
Okay, well, in terms of your experience as a health official, would you, as a health official, be of the opinion that that party has a duty to warn?
Objection form.
Not as policy, but as a matter of health in the community?
Objection form.
Well, if there are levels that are associated with risk of benzene-related diseases, that would be, considered, unacceptable to the community, then if you're not going to ventilate to get rid of those exposures, then which I mean seems to be the most common sense thing to do, then the thing would be to warn.
Now, you said that would, in the community, I want to ask that question a little differently. At what level, in the opinion of Dr. Peter Infante, epidemiologist, at what level of benzene concentrations would you say that the landlord had a duty to either warn and or ventilate, strike that, warn the tenants? At what level?
Objection.
Well, I mean, I think that's a policy decision about, what level of risk someone wants to say is acceptable or not acceptable in the community.
Well, now, is that a decision that each landlord is entitled to make for themselves?
Well, I would think that they have a state environmental protection agency in Texas. I guess that, they should follow whatever is prescribed by the state agency.
So at the level the state says that there are actionable levels of benzene, that would trigger the duty to warn. Is that your testimony?
Objection form.
Well, I'm saying that, that's a health policy decision in the state, what level they want to consider acceptable or unacceptable. And so they should go, I presume they would go by what's, required. I mean, people usually don't go by other than what's required.
Dr. Infante, as a scientist, what is your personal opinion as to the level of benzene that would trigger the duty to warn the tenant that they are being exposed to a level of benzene, whatever that trigger level is, that would cause that landlord to have a duty to warn?
Objection form.
Well, like I say, I think that's, that's up to the state to decide that.
So you have no opinion personally as to what that level is?
For environmental exposures in this situation.
Correct. You have no opinion as to what that level would be, correct?
I would say that it should be up to the state to make that determination.
If a landlord came to you and hired you as a consultant and said, Dr. Infante, I want you to tell me whether or not there is a sufficient level of benzene in this house that I'm renting that I should warn my tenant, at what level would you tell them they should warn their tenant?
Objection form.
Well, I guess that would be up to them and what level of risk they would think that is acceptable or not.
Do you think the average individual, Dr. Infante, has your knowledge as to the leukemic properties of benzene and the levels at which it does become a leukemigen?
Well, that has to do with dose response analysis, but what level somebody wants to take in terms of risk, that's up to the individual to decide that.
Well, now the tenant doesn't know that there's benzene there, right? In our hypothetical, are we on the same page there?
Oh, okay. All right, the tenant.
Tenant does not
know.
At what level does that landlord have a duty to warn you might develop diseases related to benzene exposure?
Objection form.
Well, I would say that, again, you would have to, be based on whatever the requirements are by the State Environmental Protection Agency.
So you would just merely cite them to the regulations, correct?
Objection form.
Well, I wouldn't merely cite them. I mean, first of all, no one's going to do anything unless it's required by law for the most part that I've ever seen. So they would have to know what, usually there's there's requirements that they would have to follow. So that's, I would say they should file. They need to know you'd have to know what the exposure is to make that determination.
Dr. Infante, if there is any level of benzene filtering up through the soil and into a person's house, is it not your opinion that that person should be warned that they are at risk of developing a leukemic disease as a result of that benzene exposure?
Objection form.
No, I didn't say that. I've never said that.
So there is some level at which they would not develop leukemic diseases, correct?
What I've said was that the risk depends on what the exposure is. I'm not saying that there's a cutoff, but obviously as you have less and less exposure, you have less and less probability of developing of the disease. So I'm not saying that if someone is exposed to no matter what level, they should be informed that there's a risk from that exposure.
You do agree that both individuals and the government have a duty to warn where people have their lives endangered, correct?
Objection form.
Yes. I mean, companies, individuals have a duty to warn. Yes.
And those individuals extend to landlords and homes, correct?
Objection form.
Let's go back to exhibit number 3 and
Let me turn your attention to page 94, and I hope we can do this fairly quickly.
this is another page. It's part of exhibit 3 labeled PI 94 at the bottom. This is a soil analysis table from one of the other experts, the plaintiffs in this case, Exploration Technologies, Inc. What use did you make of that document, if any?
I didn't make any use of this document.
Okay. If you could turn with me to the next page, PI 95. It's groundwater analyses. Did you make any use of this particular document?
No.
All right, we go to 90. If we go over and look at 96, 97, 98, and 99, that's just a continuation of the same document, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't make any, except to recognize that there are these, products that were measured at these levels in the water. So, I mean, from that standpoint, it indicates that there's, these chemicals in the groundwater.
Excuse me just a second, I am if you would turn back and look at page 73, PI 73 of Exhibit 3.
'73?
Yes.
Okay, let me look at the front of this, see what document it is that I'm looking at.
Yes.
Okay.
It appears to be roughly, if you look at the fax header dated June 28, 2002, it appears to have been faxed to someone at about the midpoint between your letter of May 21st accepting employment and your July 23rd, 2002 report, correct?
Yes.
Did you, my question is, this particular page, it just has the word vapor written on it. Is that your handwriting?
No.
Okay. And you understand that these are BTEX analyses, and we talk about BTEX, that's the benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene that we've been talking about, correct?
Yes.
And there are certain physical, or rather, there are certain parts per million that are listed here from samples from the 6 monitoring wells. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did you make any use of this page?
Yes.
Okay, what did you use this page for?
Well, it gave me some indication of how the benzene could vaporize from the product.
Was it significant or insignificant to you in terms of the relationship of benzene to the other benzene ring components that were found in these product headspace samples?
Objection form.
Not particularly. I mean, I focused on the benzene content.
And when we talk about ethylbenzene, that's not the same thing as benzene, is it?
Right.
And do you know of any epidemiological studies that show that ethylbenzene causes or can lead to any of the leukemia or other hemolytic disorders?
Well, whenever there have been such associations, whether it's been toluene or ethylbenzene or xylene, people have concluded that it's likely due to the benzene contamination of those products. It's related to the hematopoietic diseases, not these other products. Let's say if they were in a technical grade or pure grade form.
You'll notice that in this particular chart that benzene bears a certain relation to the total BTEX, correct? By volume?
Yes.
Okay. Now, have there been any studies that, well, I think you've answered my question concerning toluene. Have there been any epidemiological studies concerning toluene or xylene in terms of its ability, or not its ability, its tendency to cause leukemic or hemopoietic diseases?
I'm aware of toxicologic studies. I'm not aware of epidemiological studies. I'm also aware of some case reports related to hematopoietic disease in association with some of these chemicals on this page. But I think I had already expressed earlier that people usually conclude it was because of the benzene contamination of them, not the toluene or the xylene. Even though there are experimental data showing some hematotoxicity with xylene, there's not information related to leukemia with xylene.
And is that toxicological data or epidemiological data?
Toxicological data.
And Doctor, I know that you have worked with toxicologists and have had on-the-job training, but you don't hold yourself out as a toxicologist expert, do you?
Well, I think I have a fair bit of knowledge of toxicology. I've published in the Lancet and other places.
You've never
toxicological study protocols and in the utility of experimental bioassays for identifying carcinogens. So I've been published in some very good journals in that area.
You've never designed a toxicological study, though, have you?
Objection.
Well, I haven't done any. I've been involved in the design of toxicological studies, yes.
And from the epidemiological standpoint?
No, we're talking toxicological
No.
studies.
In designing the study, was your input on the epidemiological component?
I thought we were talking about toxicological studies.
We are, and they sometimes, epidemiological and toxicology, I am having a rough time today. Epidemiological and toxicity studies sometimes overlap, do they not? You'll be looking at both.
I wouldn't think the studies would overlap. No, you might have different types of studies that might relate to the same type of toxicity or related toxicity. So when I was talking about toxicological studies, I was talking about studies in experimental animals.
Oh, animals, okay.
Yes.
For example, if we look at Exhibit 4, which was your article on the ply film study, you were not doing that as a toxicologist, correct?
The ply film study is an epidemiological study.
Yes.
Right.
And what was Dr. Wagon?
He's an epidemiologist,
And Dr. Young?
industrial hygienist.
And of course, Dr. Rinsky is an epidemiologist, correct?
Yes, right.
If you would, Doctor, turn over and look at PI 75, Exhibit 3 with me.
Okay.
These are BTEX data samples taken from varying monitoring wells, correct?
Yes.
What use did you make of this particular document?
Well, it showed that you've got benzene contamination from these wells.
And again, that's not your handwriting that says product.
That's not my handwriting. This other faded handwriting looks like it's mine now.
Right, that says something ppm. Can you read it?
Yeah, 6,900 ppm.
Okay. What's the rest of it?
It says or 0.69%.
Oh, thank you. Now, this breaks down the BTEX data by, it uses the mg/kg. What does that mean?
Milligrams per kilogram.
And did you pay any attention, strike that, did you give any significance of the, strike that again, did you attach any significance, Doctor, to the relative proportion of benzene to the other BTEX components?
Objection 4.
No, I don't know. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we look here, if you look at the benzene, which is expressed as a B encircled,
Yes.
and then we look over here at xylene, you'd agree with me that on EMWs 1, 2, and 5, there's about 5 times as much weighted xylene as there is benzene, correct?
Objection 4.
Well, for it looks like 3,000 versus 12,000 milligrams per kilogram.
Okay. So about 4 times, about 4 times, or roughly 3 on some of them. And then if we look at EMW3, it's about 5 times, correct?
EMW, wait a minute.
Yeah, EMW3.
Okay, I see. Oh. Okay.
The weighted difference is roughly 5 times, correct?
Objection
Yes, at least.
And you attach no significance to that, is that correct?
Right. Not particularly, no.
Does this give you any ideas to volatilization rates?
4. Objection 4.
Well, I don't know because I don't know what the content was in the product prior to any volatilization.
I'd asked you a minute ago about toxicology. Are you board certified as a toxicologist?
No.
But you are board certified as an epidemiologist, correct?
Well, I'm a fellow of the American College of Epidemiology.
Do you have any advanced degrees in toxicology?
No.
The last documents in exhibit number 3 appear to be, the last 2 documents appear to be pleadings. Did you make any use of those?
No.
Have you been made aware of the fact that there have been 2 personal injury cases filed as part of this case?
I've been made aware of I didn't know there were personal injury cases filed that I can recall. I think I was made aware of the fact that there were 1 or 2 individuals that lived in the area that were diagnosed with leukemia.
Have we been made aware of the fact that one of the people has been diagnosed for ovarian cancer?
I don't remember that.
Ovarian cancer can be caused by pesticides, correct?
I'm not aware of that.
Do you know of any epidemiological studies that show that pesticides can cause leukemia or other hemopoietic diseases?
Pesticides?
Yes.
No.
Doctor, have you been asked to conduct any type of epidemiological study dealing with a young lady named Nubia Narita Ozuna, deceased?
No.
Have you been asked to do any type of epidemiological study concerning Liza Belinda Vela?
No.
And I think I asked you this earlier in your deposition, but you have not been asked to conduct any type of formal epidemiological study of this particular neighborhood. Is that correct?
That's correct.
As I said earlier, I'm going to let some of the other folks ask some questions, and hopefully I'll see you again in a while.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Can we take a short break?
Sure.
5 minutes max.
Off the record at 2:47:12 to 2:57:48.
Dr. Infante, I had passed the witness just a second ago, but Mr. McLean has been nice enough to let me go back on just to let you identify a document. Let me hand you what's been marked as Infante Exhibit number 5 and ask if this is the historical benzene paper that you described this morning that you recently published.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Dr. Infante, my name is Philip Warner. I'm here representing one of the defendants. First of all, I want to understand clearly what your role is in this case. When you were retained in this case, can you explain to the jury exactly what it was that you were retained, based on your understanding, to give opinions about?
I was retained to give opinions about the data and what the toxicity data was related to benzene exposure, and to provide a historical perspective on that.
All right. You were given the task of giving opinions about data. Which data are you referring to?
Well, in general literature.
Epidemiological?
Well, both, epidemiological, toxicological.
With respect to the particular group of plaintiffs that are involved in this case, you haven't been asked to, nor have you reviewed any medical records, have you?
I have not.
All right. And you have no opinions with respect to the cause of any particular disease among the plaintiffs, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And you have no opinions with respect to the actual exposure that any of the particular plaintiffs involved in this case might have had to any benzene that would have come from the groundwater contamination that you have records of among your file materials.
That was a long question. Are you saying that I'm sorry.
You're not testifying as an industrial hygienist, right?
Right.
You're not testifying as to the level of exposure that the plaintiffs had to the benzene and the groundwater that we've been talking about today, correct?
Right, that's correct.
Okay. And so with respect to any additional benzene exposure that these people might have had from that groundwater, apart from the benzene exposure that we all have as we go about our daily lives from whatever sources we have, you have no opinions about that, correct?
Objection 4.
Well, I'm testifying about the toxicity of benzene. Okay. That's what I've been asked to testify about.
So as I understand your role in the case, it's basically to testify to the jury that benzene is bad stuff and it can cause cancer. True?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Do you have an opinion as to what level of benzene is required for a person to have an increased risk of cancer? And I'm talking about body burden, ppm years, however you want to put it.
Objection 4.
Well, I think as I had testified earlier, that your risk is related to exposure, and it's related to how you receive that exposure. And so if you have very little exposure, you have very little risk. As you increase exposure, you have a higher risk. And also I'm saying that there's all the risk assessments that have ever been done for benzene and leukemia or whatever disease I'm aware of. They use non-linear, non-threshold models.
As I understand it from your last answer, then your model, your preferred model, is a linear model with respect to risk of benzene exposure?
Usually, that's what regulatory agencies use, and that's where I come from, a regulatory agency. If you're estimating exposures at low levels, you usually use linear, non-threshold models.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. The background that you come from is a governmental background, yes?
Well, I worked for OSHA for 24 years.
Right. That's a governmental agency, right?
Yes.
And OSHA's job and task is to protect the workers in the workplace, yes?
Yes.
All right. And in analyzing data, your primary function is to determine levels at which you're protecting the workers in the workplace from the consequences of exposure to things such as benzene.
Or reducing their risks.
All right. And so the approach is one of protective measures as opposed to looking back at a particular disease and determining what happened, correct?
I don't know what that means.
Well, these are prospective analyses, aren't they? They're intended to protect the workers as opposed to looking back at a population to determine what happened in the past.
Well, if you're analyzing the hazards to the situation, you do both. You look at toxicological data and you look at epidemiological data, and epidemiological data is related to past exposures, right? Or you wouldn't have, right? The disease has to relate to some exposure, so that had to have occurred before the disease. In terms of any regulation that you implement, that's for the future. That's not the past.
And when you were talking about policy decisions before, you were talking about those kinds of decisions. In other words, taking the data that you've developed and determining some future policy position about what is a safe exposure or what is an allowable exposure in the workplace. That's something for other people to decide, correct?
What you get down to, that's a policy or social decision. It's a policy decision what the actual regulation ends up being.
All right, and that's something that you have always stayed away from, correct? Policy decisions?
Well, I didn't make the final decisions on standards that I was involved in the agency that ultimately came from the head administrator, assistant secretary.
Let's talk a little bit about your.
You make recommendations, and then that's based on a lot of things. It's based on health. It's based on economics. It's based on economic, technological feasibility. There are a lot of factors that go into it.
From a regulatory standpoint, the most conservative approach to looking at data, though, is to evaluate the data based on a linear evaluation, assuming that while the risk may decrease as the level of exposure goes down, it does not disappear. That would be a conservative approach to prospective regulation of a potential carcinogen in the workplace, correct?
No, I wouldn't say that. Well, if we're talking about carcinogens, I would say we would use linear non-threshold models to extrapolate to low levels.
Well,
Yes.
in the
But that's not
temper...
conservative with benzene, because if you look at some of the information that's done, it looks like the curve goes the other way, that you get a more efficient metabolism of the benzene to the putative toxic metabolites at lower exposure levels.
You're saying that at lower exposures you have an increased risk of cancer than at higher exposures?
I'm saying that you have a higher rate per unit of exposure of metabolism to the toxic metabolites at lower exposure levels.
Is there epidemiological literature supporting the proposition that workers who are exposed to lower concentrations of benzene are at a higher level of risk of the hematopoietic cancers than persons who are exposed at a higher level?
Well, is there epidemiologic information that says that that individuals, there's some information that says that individuals exposed to higher levels, that has more of an effect on the dose response for leukemia or multiple myeloma than you might get from just a cumulative, using a cumulative dose model.
Objection responses.
Did you feel like you just answered my question?
Well, I thought I did. If I didn't, maybe I didn't understand.
You just indicated to me that at lower levels of exposure that the metabolism of benzene is more efficient, and consequently, you at least implied, or I inferred, that you get more of a carcinogenic effect at lower levels of exposure. Did I misunderstand your testimony in that regard?
A bit.
All right. Explain to me how I misunderstood your testimony.
I said that there's a preference for proportionally more of the toxic metabolites of benzene from lower exposure, so that it's not linear at low exposure levels. So if you use a linear model, extrapolating to low levels, you may underestimate risk.
All right. So what in fact what might happen according to your theory is that you might have an increased risk of hematopoietic cancer at lower levels of exposure, correct?
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, tell me what you are saying then with respect to actual risk of cancer.
What I'm saying is that if you use a linear model to extrapolate risk to lower and lower exposure levels, you may underestimate the risk of leukemia by using a linear model, because there's information showing that you have more of an efficient metabolism of benzene to the toxic metabolites at lower levels. So it's more than just proportional.
All right. And you're basing this opinion on studies that have been done of metabolism, true?
Looking at that's right, administering benzene and looking at the metabolites, the toxic metabolites of benzene.
And I thought my next question was, have you seen any epidemiological literature which would support this theory?
Objection form.
Well, it's not a theory. What it is there are toxicologic studies that show that you have a more efficient metabolism of benzene at lower exposure levels in contrast to higher exposure levels.
Are you aware of any epidemiological study that has observed an increase in the incidence of any of the cancers that are associated with benzene at these lower levels that you would attribute to this toxicologically observed phenomenon of metabolism at the lower levels that you've just been talking about.
That was a complex question. I don't understand it.
You don't understand. You have just theorized that you would expect to see an increase in leukemia at low levels of exposure, yes? Because of the metabolites of benzene, correct?
I'm saying that you have a more efficient metabolism to these toxic metabolites at lower levels than you do at higher levels, so that when you use a linear model to extrapolate risk to lower levels, you may underestimate the risk from lower exposure levels.
Right. So
I wasn't saying that you get disease from benzene at lower exposure levels.
If you're talking about a linear model, then what you're saying is, am I misunderstanding you then? You're not saying that the line of incidence, if we're talking about incidence in a population, that the incidence of leukemia increases at lower exposure levels because metabolism of benzene is more efficient when we're exposed to less of it than when we're exposed to more of it?
No, I'm saying that per unit of exposure, you may get more bang for your buck at lower exposure levels.
And you just used the word may, and my question to you is, have you seen any epidemiological literature that would support that opinion, that you get more bang for your buck at the lower levels? And if so, what is it?
Well, I think if you look at the NCI study, their dose response analysis, you see a curve that starts to taper off when you get to the highest cumulative dose level.
Which NCI study specifically?
The Hayes study. I mean, that's possible. I'm not saying that's showing that, but you're asking me, have I seen any study? And so you say, well, that's not inconsistent with the phenomenon of getting less bang for your buck at a higher exposure level.
Refresh my recollection, is the Hayes study the Chinese study? Which one of the Chinese
97.
studies?
The 97 publication.
But then you just said that you're really not saying that he says that. Can you think of any other studies other than Hayes that might support this position?
Objection.
And I'm talking about epidemiological studies.
Well, that's the largest study that's been conducted to date. I mean, one of the problems with all the benzene literature in these studies is you don't really have a lot of statistical power in any of them. But in that study, you see rather than, we were talking about dose response earlier, and I think that's how we got on this discussion. You see the curve, rather than going straight up, it starts to taper off when you get to higher exposure levels. So you were asking me, well, is there any evidence that you have more efficient metabolism at lower levels or less efficient metabolism of benzene to the toxic metabolites at higher levels, saying the same thing? And I said, well, that's perhaps one example.
Well, I'm going to object to the responsiveness. Can you think of any other studies other than Hayes 97 that support this position?
Objection for that.
Well, that's the largest study I've seen where you could really look at it. So I would say no, that's the only one that I'm aware of. And I'm still not, I'm not absolutely sure that what you're seeing in that study is a reflection of that. There could be other things going on. So you're asking me, is there some evidence of it? I'm saying perhaps in that study. Don't know for sure.
Now, with respect to your function in this case, I take it, based on the prior questions, that you haven't really been asked to do an epidemiological study of these particular plaintiffs and to compare their disease rates or anything of that nature with the population at large or with expected, correct?
You mean the community and
Community,
the
yes. Okay.
I've not been asked to do that.
So if you were designing such a study, what kind of a study would you conduct?
Objection for that.
To determine the effect of benzene on the population.
Sandwich. Objection.
And I'm talking about benzene in the groundwater that we're talking about here today. in this
Well, if you
lawsuit.
wanted to look at the effects of benzene on that population, I think you would have to follow that population for a number of years and probably do a morbidity study, look at the disease and population compared to the standard population. But you know, I can't recall how many people are in that population, so you probably have to follow them for quite a number of years to be able to have enough statistical power to make any determination. But that's one way you could do it.
Do you know how long this contamination that the plaintiffs are complaining of has been in the ground?
No.
And obviously, you don't know where it came from, right? And you don't have any opinions about that.
I don't have any opinions about where it came from. I wasn't asked to do that.
And you don't have any opinions about whether it came from natural gas wells or oil wells or filling stations or somebody cleaning out their lawnmower gas tank in their yard, true?
I wasn't asked to go into that area.
So you haven't done or attempted to do any kind of fingerprinting or other studies that might be appropriate to determine the source of any of these pollutants that are found in the ground, correct?
I was not asked to do that.
Have you seen any air monitoring in any of the houses where the plaintiffs or the plaintiffs' tenants are living to determine what actual exposure these people are getting as opposed to some modeling or guesstimate of exposure that might be done by somebody that's hired by the plaintiff's lawyers?
Objection form.
No.
What is the estimate that you have seen of the actual daily exposure that people who are living in this neighborhood are getting from contamination that's down in the groundwater under the dirt upon which they are walking?
I haven't seen estimates of that.
Would you agree with me, sir, that to the extent that there is benzene flowing in the groundwater at some level beneath our feet today, that it is really sort of irrelevant to our prospects for getting any hematopedic cancer?
Objection form.
Groundwater flowing beneath our feet today, I don't know that there is benzene in groundwater and how that's related to us.
I want you to assume for a minute with me that instead of being here, we're in McAllen, Texas, sitting in a building over the plume. Can you say whether or not the benzene flowing in the groundwater underneath our feet is relevant to our prospects for getting leukemia or any other hematopedic cancer?
Objection form.
Based on what you know.
Objection form.
Well, I think that, yeah, there is an elevated risk of exposure to the community.
Because it's in the groundwater?
Because it's in the, whatever the materials, the napple or the gasoline that's floating on top of this acreage of water that's underneath the town.
And it's based on the assumption that you have that some portion of that benzene that's down in the groundwater is making its way to the surface so that we can be exposed, yes?
Well, I saw the estimate that Madsen made as an average, and then it's also my understanding that there can be cracks in the soil so that the hydrocarbons in the benzene can then come to the surface and could contaminate homes.
But certainly only to the extent that the benzene in the groundwater migrates to the surface, evaporates, and is breathed or otherwise makes its way into the plaintiff's body, does it have any effect on the plaintiff's health, correct?
Yes.
All right. And as far as the routes of exposure that the plaintiffs might have to any of the benzene that might be in the groundwater, that's something that's outside your area, correct?
Objection form.
You don't have any opinions about that, do you?
Oh, I mean how it migrates through, or what?
Well, how it gets from the groundwater into a plaintiff's body. You don't have any opinions about how it gets there, correct?
Well, I mean, if it came up through cracks in the soil and got into the home, it would be inhaled.
So what you have an opinion is that it's possible that it would be inhaled, right?
Well, if it was in the home, it would be inhaled.
Right. You haven't been asked to give an opinion about actual exposure that these plaintiffs have to any benzene in the groundwater, true?
That's correct.
Okay. So you don't have any opinions as to where the benzene that they might inhale came from or how much of it they have inhaled, correct?
Well, it's my understanding that the benzene that they would inhale in this scenario we're talking about would come from the pollution of that plume of water under the town.
Do you know of any other sources of benzene contamination in a common sort of average American household?
Well, I'm familiar with the, what did we discuss? The TIM study or whatever it was that Lance Wallace did a number of years ago. I mean, there are other sources of benzene exposure, yes.
So simply because some trace amount of benzene is found in a household doesn't mean that that benzene necessarily came from groundwater some feet below the ground level, correct? And we can't say
No,
that,
I wasn't saying that.
In fact, if there is trace benzene detected in the household of the plaintiffs, if studies are done, if air monitoring is done, and trace amounts of benzene are found in those households, we cannot say that that benzene came from gasoline that had been underground as opposed to some other source of benzene, can we?
Objection filed.
Well, I suppose, it would depend on, what the results were, and if there were any sudden shifts in the concentration, might give you some indication. But just if you go in and take a spot sample and detect whatever level of benzene, that wouldn't necessarily mean that it came from groundwater contamination.
Certainly, epidemiologists deal with compounding factors all the time, right?
Yes?
All right. And
Confounding factors, is that what you said?
I said confounding factors,
Okay.
didn't I? Maybe I said compounding
Well, I
factors.
thought you said compounding.
I heard compounding.
Okay.
Well, that's my stop that nose.
All right.
And one of the confounding factors for detecting benzene in the home are the other potential sources of benzene that are found around these households, true?
Objection filed.
It could be something that you'd have to entertain in your analysis.
And it would not be scientifically appropriate or reliable not to take these potential confounding factors into account when you're determining the source of any benzene that is measured on any of these properties that are owned or occupied by any of the plaintiffs in this case. True?
Objection filed.
Well, I think if you found, elevated levels of benzene in a particular home, you certainly would want to try to identify the source of it, yes.
Wouldn't it be appropriate to actually look for other potential sources of benzene if you found some concentration of benzene in any of these properties?
Sure. Could do that.
Shouldn't you do that as a scientist if you're actually trying to find out the source of the benzene contamination?
Objection filed.
I would think so. I guess you could probably address these questions to the engineer.
Based on the data that you have seen, do you have an opinion or not as to whether any of the plaintiffs in this case have double the background risk of any particular hematopedic cancer
Objection filed.
from this plume that we're talking about here today?
Objection filed.
I don't have any opinion on that at this point.
Have you ever testified in a federal case? And I'm talking about litigation.
In a federal case, what do you mean, like federal government was involved?
Or like a federal court?
A federal court.
Yeah, I can shorten this. Let
believe
me
I
ask a
have.
different
Yeah.
question. Have you ever prepared a list of cases in which you have given either testimony or deposition testimony or trial testimony?
Yes, I did.
All right. Do you have that available back at your office?
I don't know. I can look. I think it was developed by an attorney that I was working with on a case.
By the way, do you maintain an office separate from your home?
Well, I have, it's part of my home, but it's in a separate building.
Could you produce the list of cases that you have, if you have it?
Yes, sir.
I would request that you do so then. When is the last time you testified before today?
I think in November.
Was that here in Washington, D.C.?
No, it was in Orange County, California.
Have you ever testified at the trial of a case?
The trial of a case, yes.
Yes.
This was a trial.
Okay. And what kind of trial was that?
It was a trial related to beryllium exposure, and I was testifying as I think as a rebuttal witness of what was known by whom, when, about the toxicity of beryllium.
Let me ask you something about your testifying experience. Have you ever testified as a toxicologist?
As a toxicologist?
Yes, sir.
Well, no.
Have you ever given toxicological testimony other than based on your knowledge as an epidemiologist and your review of epidemiological literature?
I've given testimony regarding the toxicological study results related to benzene, yes.
All right. And you're talking about what, the metabolism studies and things of that nature that are more toxicology oriented as opposed to epidemiology studies?
Well, you asked me if I testified regarding toxicological findings.
Right.
You're talking about, by that I mean experimental studies.
All right. Animal studies?
Animal studies, yes, I have.
Okay. Metabolism studies, things of that nature?
Yes.
All right. Were these, was this testimony in a benzene case?
Yes.
All right. Do you hold yourself out to the scientific community as a qualified toxicologist?
Objection from.
Well, I wasn't testifying as a toxicologist. I was testifying on the toxicity of benzene, and part of the toxicity of benzene relates to some experimental study results because they all relate together in terms of biological plausibility. It helps reinforce observations in humans and vice versa.
Well, let me cut to the chase. Are you going to testify in front of this jury that you are an expert in the field of toxicology? Or not?
I'm testifying on the information on the toxicity of benzene, and so I think I'll testify about the toxicity of benzene, which is known. It's most of the information I testify about is in humans. Then there's some in experimental animals that's related to that, so I will include that in my testimony.
Do you have opinions in this case about any material other than benzene as being a potential hazard to these individuals?
I wasn't asked to look at that information.
Do you plan to look at that?
Not as far as I know today, no.
So the only material that you're concerned about as we sit here today is benzene in this case?
It's the only one I've been asked to comment about.
You indicated that an accepted convention was the 95% confidence interval. Is that something that you agree with?
Well, it could be 95 or it could be a 90% confidence interval. I've seen both in studies
Are you perfectly
and in
happy?
risk assessments.
What is the accepted standard in the epidemiological community with respect to confidence intervals? Is it 95 or is it 90?
Objection failed.
I think I've seen both used. You could use either one.
Is 90% less reliable than 95%?
No, actually, a 90% confidence interval is, for occupational studies, seems reasonable because it's similar like to doing a one-tailed test. And when you do a statistical analysis, and for toxic exposures in the workplace, I favor a one-tailed test. Because we're only
Explain to me what you mean by a one-tailed test.
Well, we're only interested in the toxicity and the hazards of the exposures, let's say in the occupational setting or to the environment. We're not really interested in the benefits from exposure to toxic chemicals. That's a little bit different than if you were studying a drug where there could be some health benefits or there might be some harmful side effects. So I'm saying in the latter situation, you would use a two-tailed test. I would be in favor of studies being done in the occupational setting where you just use a one-tailed test.
Okay. So with respect to toxicity of benzene, you agree that an appropriate and acceptable confidence interval for application in epidemiology would be 90% as opposed to 95%?
No, I'm saying people use either.
As far as you're concerned, they're both about the same?
Well, I just said I would be in favor of a 90% confidence interval for toxic substances, not for drugs. But I've seen both used, and I think it's conventional to use either.
All right. Do you consider that then that statistics based on confidence intervals of 90% are statistically reliable from an epidemiological standpoint when determining the consequences of exposure in the population?
Well, I've seen a number of risk assessments that use 90% confidence intervals around the estimates of risk.
So the answer to my question is?
Yes. I'd be comfortable with that, of course.
What does confidence interval measure?
It's measuring the degree of variability in your estimate of risk.
It in fact measures the likelihood that you're correct, true, in the conclusions that you're drawing?
Well, it measures you use the word correct. What it's saying is that you're 90 or 95% confident that that risk that you just estimated is between these two outside numbers.
And by confident, you're talking about confident that you're correct as opposed to confident that you're wrong. True?
No, you're 90 or 95% confident that your estimate of risk is between those two numbers.
Do you agree that if your 95 or 90% confidence interval includes 1, that is the background level, that the epidemiological study results are not statistically reliable?
If it includes 1, it's like a lower bound of your estimate, I would think that would be significant.
You don't think that?
I would think it would be, yes. You're talking about right at 1.
Well, if it includes unity, that
1.
means it goes below 1. It's going to include it, it has to go below 1, right? Okay? So yes, below 1.
Well, if it's below 1, then then, it would not be a statistically significant.
Okay, and 1 represents background, right?
If you're looking at relative risk, yes. If you're looking at a confidence interval and you have a lower bound of 1 and you have an upper bound of, let's say, 4 or 5, I would say that results that's statistically elevated.
With respect to the plaintiffs in this particular case, do you have any message for them at this point based on what you know?
No.
You're not going to tell them to move, are you?
It's not my area of expertise.
Well, let's assume that these were friends of yours or acquaintances of yours or people who are paying lawyers to pay you for your expertise in this case. And you're hired as an epidemiologist with all your background, working for the government for many years in this area. And these folks are living over this plume that you have some information on. Based on the information that you have, is it time for these people to split? Is it time for them to move?
Well, first of all, I don't have information on all those decisions, and number 2, I haven't been asked to do that in this case.
All right.
So I don't
Well, I'm
plan on
asking
doing
you
it.
to do that. Based on the information that you have at hand, would it be your recommendation that the plaintiffs move or not move?
I wouldn't, that recommendation is beyond my knowledge I have about all the factors in this case.
All right. And what additional knowledge do you need in order to make a recommendation for these people?
Well, I wouldn't make that recommendation. That's up to state agencies, and a lot of factors go into that of what people want to decide to do. I wasn't hired to do that. I don't plan to do it, and I don't know what else to say.
What other factors go into it besides the risk of? What other factors are there in this case besides what you have postulated as a potential risk of various cancers?
I don't know all
Certainly
the factors.
you're not suggesting some fire or explosion risk, are you?
I don't know all the factors, so I'm not commenting on it.
Well, what about you? Would you move into this neighborhood knowing what you know?
No, I would not.
What other information would you like to have before you would move into this neighborhood?
I'm not going to speculate about all this stuff. That wasn't what I was asked to do.
Church responses.
Well, you're testifying that the people in this group who are suing all our clients may be at an increased risk of cancer. You won't give me an opinion as to whether they should move or not. You won't give me an opinion as to whether or not they need to do anything else about this. But you said you wouldn't move there, but now you won't tell me why you wouldn't move there. Now, why is it that you wouldn't move there based on the data that you have in front of you?
There are a lot of factors beyond this case of why I wouldn't move there, okay? And it has to do with my own personal life, and I don't feel like going into all those. It's not related to the toxicity of benzene. I wouldn't move there because they're living on top of that, but there are a lot of factors besides that in my personal life that would result in me
It's
not
beautiful
moving there.
orange
And I
grove country. What's wrong with it?
Counsel, this is getting argumentative. Unless we're going to get to the substance, I'm going to stop the deposition.
Okay. You've never been to McAllen, Texas, have you?
No, sir.
Have you ever spoken with any of the plaintiffs?
No.
Have you ever spoken with any of the other experts that have been retained by the lawyers in this case?
No.
Have you ever spoken with anyone about this neighborhood other than the lawyers in the case?
Have I ever spoken with anyone who lives in the neighborhood? No, and let me rephrase that about the other experts. I don't know this case, so I don't know if I've ever spoken to any of them because I don't know who they are really.
Did you pick up the phone and call any of your friends, other professionals about this case?
No.
All right. So all the information contained in your report came from you and the studies that you've relied on in the report, yes?
Yes.
All right. And with respect to the information about the plume that you have, that's all the material that was supplied to you by Council for Plans, right?
Yes.
All right. And you haven't done any independent investigation of that situation down there to determine on your own what the situation is apart from that material that you received?
That's correct.
All right. Let's go ahead and switch tapes. We got less than 5 minutes apparently.
This concludes tape 2 in the deposition of Dr. Peter F. Infante off the record at 3:40:58.